Now, looking at the number of people and excitement in the room, we know this panel is highly anticipated, and we are extremely fortunate to have with us here the friends of ZEG, the world-renowned journalist and war reporter, Jon Lee Anderson. Please come on stage. And an actor and a director, Sean Penn, everyone. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Nino. Thank you, ZEG. Thank you, Impact Hub, Ajara, everybody who made this possible. Thank you, Natalia, all of your team, and thanks, Sean, for coming. So, can everybody hear me? Great. Thank you all. So I think I'm assuming that most of you are here and know of Sean Penn because of his fame as an actor and as a director. There's another side to Sean as well, which is how we've gotten to know each other, which is that he's one of the, I would say, a rarity in Hollywood. There are, of course, some great people there who do some great things in the real world as well as on screen. But Sean has shown an interest for many years in the history, I would call it the history of his time, of our time. And he once and again has put himself, not seeking publicity, many times it's not been noticed, but has gone to places where things are happening. This goes back a long time. I was aware that Sean was in New Orleans when the Hurricane Katrina devastated that city, in Iraq just before the American invasion of 2003. We crisscrossed in a few places, in Cuba, and Bolivia, and Venezuela, and again in Haiti, which is, I think, when we finally met in 2010. An earthquake hit that country and devastated it, killing over 200,000 people. Unbeknownst to a lot of the world, Sean set up an NGO, I guess you'd call it, a relief program, which has been running ever since. It operates now not just in Haiti. During COVID, it did a lot of vaccinations in California for people that didn't have the ability to get them. And most recently in Poland and Ukraine. So there's that side as well. And this is the main topic of our discussion today, Ukraine. At some point in the last couple of years, along with all of the rest of us, Sean became very interested in Ukraine and began going there. And he's been going there, he's been there many times since just before the conflict started and until now. Iraq, Venezuela, the catastrophes of Haiti and other countries. What drew you to Ukraine? What was this? And what draws, two questions. Why Ukraine? What about Ukraine? Because you went there just before the invasion, in fact. And I guess, answer that, and then I have another one for you, please.
Well, if I focus it on the part of it that was Ukraine, it was in many ways, and maybe we'll circle back to this, similar to Haiti, as much an accident as anything else, and one that I would say has been an incredibly enriching accident for me to have been borne witness to. But that is not to say that I wouldn't trade it for it not happening. Originally, a friend of mine, someone I had started a couple of documentaries that fell short of our aims. I'd made a couple of trips to Syria to do something about how Assad had survived 5 years after the Arab Spring, and we were promised certain accesses that ultimately didn't come up, and so that when we were not going to have, I didn't feel that my value added as a documentarian was going to be that I was going to be the sharpest journalist, ask the toughest questions, but more to engender trust by being trustworthy, and to be able to have the freedom and access to speak to everyone. And original promises in Syria were diminished, and I felt, well, I'll step out of that one because there will be better people for that job where they are dealing with those restrictions. Then another one on Jamal Khashoggi. We started shooting. In other words, this is a partner of mine that we had, for different reasons, come to false starts on important stories and left them, not for the least of which reasons were because formidable people we found out were looking to tell the same story. And we thought, okay, well, that's what's important, that it be told. In this case, that same partner came to me because, and this is, I want to be clear, as you all know, we know the war didn't start on February 24th, and that this evolution of war and invasion by Russia was an ongoing conflict. Nonetheless, most of what we in America, and I would say shamefully myself, knew and paid attention to, because God knows there's so much bandwidth being occupied by so many stories around the world today. But what was highlighted was that the comic actor who played a president, who became the president, had an attempt upon him to be puppeted by the President of the United States in exchange for defensive weapons, humanitarian-based weapons and ammunition systems. And we thought it would be a really fun story to tell while being able to, go to a place that had become a flashpoint in even the American news cycle. This was pre-COVID. It was certainly before the Russian buildup that led to the story we ultimately told. I met President Zelensky first during the COVID period on Zoom. It was only because of COVID that we didn't get to start when we wanted to start. It was only because of a lot of other accidents of time and nature that we ended up where we were when we were on this story. And that's been, this also just to round out the question that often comes up and that Jon Lee has mentioned about, my involvements and things, is I've had the privilege of being able to take time off from work, to afford a plane ticket, to follow my curiosity. Having a famous face gets you easier access than maybe far more legitimate journalists. And so how do I harness that? And how can I talk to the me without those benefits? Curious people who care, but are losing context. And so this film is the pursuit of offering that context.
Sean, I watched an earlier Raw cut, which, hopefully all of you will be able to see soon, the finished film. But I watched you in the editing process about 3 weeks ago in LA. And so I had the benefit of seeing the whole arc of the story from the beginning. And I know that the way Sean has positioned himself in this as the American who doesn't understand that part of the world and is going on a learning curve. And he tries to meet President Zelensky, whom he finally does in person, a few hours before the invasion begins. at that moment, neither of them knew, I don't think, that it was really going to happen. And so that set off that extraordinary stroke of timing, which doesn't often happen in any world, set off this experience, which has ended up as this film, which you've called Superpower. I wanted I mean, you've just explained that, I asked sort of why Ukraine, and you've just explained, well, it was a good idea to do a film and there was access and so on, but, you know, you're Sean Penn. You have 2 Oscars, or did until you gave one to Zelensky. You have a host of feature films behind you. You don't need to make documentary films, so why do it? Why make documentary films about the world we live in? What is it about that narrative, the journalistic narrative, that's attracted you?
I think increasingly, well, I can say that for everything in my life, and I think a lot of people experience life this way, you know, we get asked to pie chart the sectors of our life, and in fact, it's still just one pie, and so what generally is considered creative expression is really just expression, and you can go down the track on all of that. I know my experience of life or the work that I've gotten to do is not broken down in those sectors. It's exactly the same experience at its best, where you're involving yourself or pursuing questions as an actor in a movie, or as a director or a writer in film, as in making a documentary. And as it turns out today, with rare exceptions like the previous panelist, he's among the last of the satirists that are relevant in a global satire that is real. And so I'm hard pressed to watch movies if they're not documentaries these days. And I started making the movies that I did for so many years and will again, and I have a great affection for the scripted, the imagining of fictional stories or plays. But right now in the world, as it turns out, documentary is, to me, the principal expression. And so I think that's what got me there.
So, yeah, thank you.
And comedy, when comedy owns itself. It was also the previous panel. I was so impressed with that panel on colonialism, and partly because I saw 3 people with 3 totally different histories who were able to sort of challenge each other and grow each other's thoughts and allow us to do that. And none of that possible without humor. That in all of the philosophical, experiential, and academic knowledge that they shared, and that they sang like a band that was improvising together like a pickup jazz band, that can't happen without humor. And so I promise that I will be in pursuit of my humor increasingly as time goes on.
Sean, I know that, I mean, it's one thing to have a good idea, a great idea, and go over, and the idea that this guy, Zelensky, whom we saw come to relevance during the first impeachment trial against Trump, and somehow Ukraine had a significance in the American domestic drama of those years, and the conceit for any filmmaker feature, or otherwise, or documentarian, is that this is just a damn great story. Here's an actor who actually made it to the presidency after starring in a series about a guy who accidentally becomes president. You couldn't make it up. And the idea of you as an actor going and getting to know him is a further kind of wonderful conceit. It turned out very differently. And so I guess my question is, fast forwarding, I know that Ukraine, I know that the film project, I know that this part of the world now means a lot more to you in an intense way than it did perhaps a year and a half ago. And because you've returned there repeatedly, you've lived there, you've visited the front line, you've met people whose lives have been shattered and turned dynamic by the war. That's the reason you also came here to Georgia, I know, because you're aware of its juxtaposition with Russia, with Ukraine, and the significance of what happened here in Georgia in 2008. So, yeah, if you can, just tell us. I know that it's been a kind of learning curve. And so what does Ukraine mean to you now? Again, you're still an American. You're still the actor, Sean Penn. You've done this film. What has been that experience for you? What have you learned? What does Ukraine mean to you now? What does it signify? Yeah.
So, yes. I am an American born in the year 1960. If you track that chronology, I am 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, almost 14 years watching what we as kids called the war show, which was the Vietnam War, which, unlike today, and unlike the embedded journalism that we saw happen and the censorship of seeing bodies coming home that happened, that was on television every day. And I thought, boy, are adults stupid. And so we are also, and I think that to love one's country is to recognize this, and in my case, the United States of America, that I love, is to recognize something that was said so beautifully in that earlier panel of 3 when talking about colonialism. The enemy is the great Russia, the great America, the exceptional. We have our good days and we have our bad all the way around the globe. But why Ukraine is, and why this film of any film I've been involved in, my involvement on the ground as an implementer with CORE started in 2010 in Haiti. And we've still got 85 permanent staff in Haiti. We're in about 12 countries now. We've exploded in a kind of a global NGO. So why would I say, and I do, that Ukraine is the most important of any investment I've ever made or any gift that's ever been given me? Because it's the unity that our United States promised us that I experienced for the first time anywhere in the world in Ukraine. Total unity. And that goes to what the gentle lady from Cameroon said in terms of the, intergenerational, the wisdom of the old interacting with the young, the inverted leadership of the young who understand technology in ways that can be positive, interacting with the old and everything in between. We're now in that time and place where we recognize, what Malcolm Gladwell, sort of with anthropological data proved gives us not only longevity, but happiness as human beings, which is community. And so in my lifetime, Ukraine, and of course, without Georgia, there's no Ukraine, and vice versa in this spirit. And just to end the point, that's sort of, you know, the random way in which, I don't know how it gets all told in the end, but between our different orientations and countries, but as one American, it's not just Ukraine that gave me the gift of Ukraine. It's Ukraine that gave me the gift of Georgia, of learning here now, and so. But it goes back to the fact that, despite the devastating way that it's occurring right now, the America I was promised is alive and well in Ukraine.
I know that in the film, Sean, you try to answer the questions that sort of everyman America may have, you know, about this country with its deeply complex history, you know, its relationship or toxic relationship, and now war, invasion from Russia. And you explore this, and you put yourself in the same situation as anyone else that goes over there. You have the luck of being able to sit with Zelensky several times, over time, with other people in Ukraine, with ordinary people and others, and you ask them the kind of questions, seeking simple answers, seeking a kind of truth that overcomes all of the, you know, all of the guff, all of the propaganda, and all of the noise that inevitably grows in any conflict. And I think that's what you're trying to share with other Americans, because despite what you just said about America as alive in Ukraine, I know your point. There is nonetheless, just as the colonial panel was talking about, this narrative that's out there that is somehow the Putin narrative. And that we've seen troublingly take root in our country. And it came from the White House. It came from Donald Trump, you know. Somehow or other, this idea of a question mark, whether it was about Ukraine or COVID or anything else, equality between the races, between the sexes, all of that's been thrown into question again, and now has taken root toxically amongst, I hope it's a minority of the population, right? So that's where I see, personally, as a journalist, this film doing great potential good, because you're not setting yourself up as an expert. It's not, you know, you're not out there as a pundit, and it's not even the kind of celebrity signature doc. You know, it's not whatever his name is, Stanley Tucci discovering the cuisine of Italy. No, this is you go over and you answer questions because you want to know what's going on. Meanwhile, the conflict evolves before your eyes. Just as we arrived here in the last few days, we saw the latest thing. Yarmolenko was referring to it, obviously really worried. The destruction of the dam and the effects of that beyond the war, even just on Ukraine itself. We're seeing catastrophic behavior taking place every day. There's two things I'm asking, I guess, here. One is, and it's a parallel track, it's you, as Sean, who've been over there and seen this conflict. When you go and you're in a conflict, you get a sense of it. You get a sense, you know you have to go back at a certain point because you no longer feel it, right? You get a sense of the dynamic. When you're there, you kind of know what's going to happen next. And you know whether you should be really, really worried or feel somewhat hopeful. So I'm wondering, I don't know exactly how you leave us with the film, but I'm wondering how you feel about it. Having, on the one hand, created this thing, this story that we will watch, and your own sense of having been there. I mean, you're on the one hand inspired and buoyed up by the behavior you've seen, and on the other hand, are you worried? Are you still worried? Is it an existential thing for you? How do you think this is going to turn out? There's a bunch of questions there. Choose which one you know.
I mean, I think I can answer them all pretty simply. If one measures their worry by more children who will lose their fathers and mothers in battle, be they soldiers or civilians, that worry is there every day, and that's its own existential horror we all deal with. Damaged infrastructure, all the threats that means when, to a young democracy that's now going to have to absorb post-war billions of reconstruction dollars and somehow walk and chew gum at the same time so as to be able to absorb it without being accused of corruption or squandering, it's a pretty tough game. Here's what I'm not worried about. And I'm not worried about it because of the courage of the Ukrainian people at large. I'm not worried about it because what I saw in the man I met, President Zelensky, on the 23rd February, who was this charming head of state wearing a suit, being very welcoming, talking very soberly about the possibilities of where things were going to go. And of course, there was already a bit of an increased incursion in the East. And the man that I met the next day was the same as the difference between the Ukrainian people, that overnight the switch was flipped, and it was as though, kind of like the accident of the Beatles coming out of Liverpool at that time and that place, never to be reimagined again. As it turned out, Ukraine was the Beatles, Zelensky was the Beatles, and on the 24th, the inspiration that will last throughout history was there. So am I worried about the end game of this war? That already happened. Ukraine won. This inspirational Beatles record will never stop being the destruction of authoritarian governments for the history, for the future of the world. So, yeah.
By the way, I'm not going to hog Sean all night. I know that plenty of you would like to talk to him, and we'll get to that shortly. A couple more questions, though. I mentioned that I happened to see Sean was living this in his house. When I came in, you'd been 3 weeks, basically, cutting this around the clock. And I think that was before the last 3 weeks. Yeah, exactly. And one night, he invited several people over. I'm not going to mention their names, but these are very influential people in America, inhabiting different spaces in business community, Hollywood, and so on. And they watched the rough cut of the film with us that he'd just been sweating over. And it was without music. It didn't have all the, nice seams that you see tonight. And I was curious to see what their reactions were. And it was interesting because they sat through, there was even a technical glitch, as I remember. They sat through it, and they were really interested and asked a whole bunch of questions of Sean afterwards. And it reminded me of your role with, the relief work you've done. You've had an ability to raise funds in that part of the world that you inhabit, that you're known in, which has, directed amazing resources to areas that need it. like Haiti. And I remember you were talking about like what the Ukrainians needed. And and I was reminded about the power sometimes of storytelling, of film, whether it's print or storytelling or film. It kind of doesn't matter. And what does matter is who tells it and how you tell it, and the ability of that storytelling to change things, which kind of brings us back to ZEG and what the purpose of this forum is too, and the synergies. I hate these kind of words like synergies, but it's true. You bring people together, a kind of alchemy happens, it works, it creates a combustive element that goes on from there. I don't know what will happen with those friends you invited over, but I remember seeing how impressed they were, because Sean had taken them on a journey of a place that they'd been hearing about in the news. They're worried about, there's a lot of propaganda about, and they understood his point of view, which is kind of our point of view at the end of the film. And, these are people with the means to lobby others, to direct resources, to this arena. And that was impressive to see. So I don't know. I know that that's not the reason you made the film, but I happen to know that you never just leave well enough alone. If you really feel about something, you lobby for it. You argue passionately. You go to Washington. You go here. You go there. You try to intervene in any way you can. And that's kind of what you're doing with Ukraine too, right? Intervene in not the word that we usually think of. Intervene in a good way. You know what I mean?
Well, first of all, Jon Lee did not actually accurately talk about how we met. We really met. Yes, the chronology was right, but I was a fanboy of his journalism, and I pursued. And for anyone who wants to delight in what journalism is at its best, just go to the beginning and read every article, read the books, the definitive books, including on this controversial Che Guevara. So there's that. But the only thing I'd parse words on is, whether it's me or someone else not leaving well enough alone. Well, it isn't well, so we're not leaving well enough alone, and that's, I am infinitely and only increasingly aware of the magic opportunities that time, circumstance, and the GPS coordinates of where I was born have given me the opportunity to do things in ways that are louder or, I guess freer than most people in the world. So I cannot take most people to task for the fact that I only see it as citizenship, whether it's citizenship as an American or as the world or whatever it is. And I think that, everywhere the expectation should be involvement. The expectation of ourselves, of our children, of our societies would be involvement. And there's something that someone I'm a great fan of, the actor's performer Stephen Fry said in a very interesting monk debate, where we have to really invest in the beauty of being uncertain and not fall for orthodoxies of thought, and give our children that freedom to question, because those things that make us feel good, feel free, do have thousands of years of history for those who are data-driven to prove them. And that it is not by holding people under tyranny. The prisoner is the imprisoned in all of that. And there is a part of human nature that should dictate our citizenship. And it's just being honest and listening and seeing where and how the different physics of the world culturally, where we can have the humility to baby step forward together, because demanding utopia tomorrow, which some people do very cynically in my political party in the United States, because it serves their means to their constituencies. Maybe if you want progressive agendas, maybe don't call them socialism. Maybe just call them quality of life and basic, human rights.
I'm not sure where we're at in time, but no, I'm not cutting it off. I'm gonna let people ask questions. I could continue to do this for a while here, but Sean, I know that I'm not sure it's appropriate, but I'm going to ask you anyway, because I know that he means a lot to you, and that the things he says means a lot to you. William Soroyan. I just wonder if there's something. I was quite moved by you citing him, and I know that you carry his words close to you, and so maybe if you wouldn't mind, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about him, and maybe if you can, since you're in a philosophical mood, share some of the lines of that, if you could, because it's great, I think. Yeah, thanks.
So, Jon Lee's question is about someone that many of you are aware of, and I would assume many are not. In my view, one of the great playwrights in American history, in the English language, William Soroyan. What's also interesting is that earlier in panel, there was some discussion, I think valuable, and again from a great humorist, about, I think Roald Dahl came up, and there was a question from over here having to do with, historically cherished texts, be they children's books or otherwise, whether they need to be politically correctly, surgically changed. My view on this is really simple and probably certain, because there are exceptions to every rule and foolish consistencies, the hobgoblin of etc. I think that's what brand new introductions are for by publishers, to give parents, if they needed, a guide to explaining the context of that book which they are going to share with their children, but don't change one fucking word of what he wrote. And that's how I feel about that stuff. So William Soroyan, a hero in one sense of mine, in what he gave of words and thoughts, is also, in some quarters, was also allegedly a wife beater. That does not diminish what the thoughts at their best, when functioning at their best, could give us, because we get to claim them, we get to own them. And that's our right, and that was the obligation of the writer, to give them to us. Art is not to be sequestered, it's to be shared. It doesn't exist if it's not shared. Like love, like life. And when I look at Ukraine, along with our friend Vladimir, who we saw speak, who is a major contributor to our film. And the chairman of the Central Bank of Ukraine, Pishny, we interview him. And this is a spoiler, but it takes nothing away from anyone's viewing because he's his own poetic creature, and I can tell you what he said, and I'll never be able to tell you how he said it. But it would so be our inclination in a country that in my lifetime has not been invaded by anything but idiocy. And we're so privileged to think, well, you know, hatred. No, you can't hate. And how arrogant it would be. And I found this sitting with him because he was talking about hate. He put his hand on my shoulder in the interview. And he said, Sean, all I can do is hate. But when I see the same thing in my daughters, I can't accept it. I want them to sing, to laugh, to have children, to dance, to do whatever they want. And for them to not hate. Right now, in Ukraine, we must. I can't tell somebody like that, but you've got to learn to forgive. They already know it. Right now, they've got to do what they've got to do to be mission-focused. So there's a piece of the William Saroyan's play, The Time of Your Life, opens with the words, "In the time of your life, live." This was a preamble that was printed, I think, only in the published text of his play, The Time of Your Life. Some productions would have a voice of God or a narrator come on and say it. Others just took it as a spirit guide. It's not in the body of the play. But you could call it a poem. For me, I call it a Bible in a few paragraphs. And one of the lines in it, which should not be still part of our reality, but must be understood that it is. And what I see in Ukraine and what you have experienced, I assume, in Georgia, is that if the time comes in the time of your life to kill and have no regret. That's not the last line, because the last line talks about all of us needing to add to, in the wondrous time that is the time of our lives, to not add to the misery of it, but to add to the infinite delight and mystery of it. And that's where it lands.
Yeah. I mean, Sean, I could ask you more questions. And, you know, it's on my mind, but I'm going to let a Georgian ask that, I think, is like, what do you think of Georgia so far? So I'm going to let somebody else ask that question. And you know, I'd like to hand it open to you to be able to ask the questions you have of Sean. And do I need to hand over this microphone, or is there one out there? And is there anybody who would like to begin by asking a question? The young gentleman over there with his hand in the air.
Yeah, thank you very much for being here.
Over there,
yeah.
I think. Oh, there.
Good evening.
Okay.
I just want to say something that is super obvious for everybody, I think, who is here, that right now Georgia is ruled by pro-Russian government who is spreading Kremlin propaganda on a daily basis while there are Georgian soldiers dying on the Ukrainian ground. And I guess I don't really have a question, but I have a favor to ask you to give us your encouragement in this time, because Georgian people are always on the edge of becoming nihilistic, of losing hope. There are young people my age going in migration every day and seeking asylum in Europe, in States, in different parts of the world. But we really want to live here. We really want to build this country without Russia's influence and just have the best future for us and for our children. But some people don't allow us to do that. So I guess I want to ask you, what's your perspective about that situation, how we can go through that collectively as a nation? Thank you very much.
Look, I think that the fairest way to answer this, the only way I know how to answer this, that I wholly know, is very personal. But I've had a mantra that I've lived up to varying degrees in success and failure, but it's consistently been a strong thing for me, like, for example, in making a film. And you get in the editing room and you say, look, people don't always know when they're being lied to, but they always know when they're being told the truth. I can say to Georgians that I'm going to tell the truth, which I know, and this is embarrassing, but that's the truth. I know more about Georgia in the last 24 hours than in the 62 plus years that preceded it. And oh boy, am I going to talk about Georgia. And it's fraternity, it's sorority, it's solidarity with Ukraine. What I would say about Georgia is that, you know, the misleading word is but maybe I'm limited in coming up with a better one, but I'd like it to be reflective of something. There are a lot of people in my country who just need context. Fake news and real news. The mainstream is, and behind closed doors, as you know, we'll all admit, sensationalists first, ratings-driven, sell-driven first. Not because there aren't incredible journalists within the body of it. They're more frustrated than the rest of us because they sacrifice in and out of their own homelands, away from their families, at great risk. And sometimes the important podium is within one of these monolithic organizations. But the Georgian people are the power of Georgia, as the Ukrainian people are the power of Ukraine, and as I hope we remember in the United States, are the power there. And I guess the answer is just to say, your story is not that hard to tell, and the rest of us need to help tell it. In the film, I won't give this away, but in either case, I guess the best answer is, and I've said this about Ukraine, and I've felt it here. The truth in Georgia is more powerful than any weapon that its opposition has.
There's a fellow who has his hand up there. Yep.
Hi, my name is Salome. Thanks for being here. I lived for many years in a different country. I'm not going to name the country because it's not important, but I encountered very strong anti-American sentiments in that country, and as a consequence, in my understanding, very strong sympathy towards the current Russian regime. After the war started, what I saw among my friends, and I have very dear friends there, this fact kind of attenuated their sympathy towards Ukrainians. This is my personal impression, but this is a very personal, important question for me, because they say this is hypocritical, how much attention West has given to the Ukrainian problem. And my answer, being Georgian, is obvious to that, but I think you are the person who could give a very interesting answer to that. Thank you.
So if I understood, I didn't hear it all perfectly, but I think what you're saying is that your home country is very sympathetic to Russia. Is that part? No. What did I missed?
No. I'm Georgian.
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I lived in a country which was very sympathetic towards Russia. It's not a post-Soviet country,
right.
Okay? And I have very good friends, very educated people, very smart, very good people. And I was shocked by the sympathy towards Russia. For me, being Georgian, that was crazy, toward the regime in Russia. And now the impact of that sympathy on their assessment of the current situation in Ukraine. And they call it hypocrisy. That's what worries me.
Yeah. Well, I would say that on a cellular level, hypocrisy is one of the areas that we all share most. And that's one of the diseases we want to evolve out of. I think that a lot of where social trending goes is actually counterproductive to that. And that goes into a discussion of language but let me, again, if I'm understanding it, so Ukraine, in your question, is getting particular focus for something that many others are experiencing in other parts of the world. Yes. I think that because it's such a legitimate concern for so much of the world beyond that which I was born in America, right? So we have not suffered in my life, in my time period, those injustices the same way. I don't know if this is objectivity. This would be up to you to interpret. If it's objectivity that one gets as an American or not. But I get a little uncomfortable when one neglected or oppressed country, culture, people becomes envious of the focus that another such encumbered country gets. But rather that the joining of forces, the horizontal conversation that the colonial panel embodied is where there's mutual empowerment. What a silly conversation to get into. Well, I suffered more than you or longer than you because of the... At the end of the day, I made a movie some years ago called Milk about a homosexual politician in the United States named Harvey Milk who was assassinated. And when we drew all of his friends and colleagues and campaign workers, grassroots workers together with the actors involved in the film, a film, by the way, which I would not be permitted to star in today, in the same way that pretty soon only Danish princes can play Hamlet. Now, to me, that's just stupid and full of shit. But I get it. Like, I get where, and that's the same parallel about competing factions for basic human rights with longer histories, other histories. It's a great way to be divided by the bad guys and the bad ideas. So where we gain strength together is was put together in a great way to me by the person who put that dinner together for all of us doing Milk. And gaining the trust of Harvey Milk's friends to share all the stories. And what he did, and this is a man named Cleve Jones, who was the founder of the AIDS quilt. You know, they did that big quilt that they sent, and everybody's lost child or brother or sister or father or mother, had their place in it, those who had been lost to the AIDS epidemic in the United States. And he opened this conversation for all of us to engage individually with our counterparts by saying, you know, throughout our struggle, throughout in America, the homosexuals' struggle for equal rights and so on, our liberal heterosexual friends, and we appreciated their support, but they all thought it was about that the only difference between us is sex. And he said, you know, the sex is the same. That's just about friction and body parts and pheromones. He says the difference is our experience of oppression. And I think it's in seeing that and saying, how dare I share my experiences of oppression as an American, but acknowledge them for what they are as part of the conversation, not in competition or God knows not believing they are of an equal level of so many others, but that we bond in beating the shit out of oppression, right?
Yeah. All right, now we have time for one more. So, a bit like Armando Iannucci said in the last one, you know, this better be good. Now, put the spotlight on them.
By the way, if I'm Armando Iannucci, I know I wake up tomorrow and I go, oh gosh, I have a field day satirizing this self-important actor from Hollywood, and I'll look forward to it because you do it great.
So, is there
yes.
Is there one person who would like to ask a question?
Hello?
Yes.
I
have okay, you're standing there with your mic,
yeah,
so
already,
you've got it.
Okay, everybody can hear me. Thank you very much.
Speak loudly, put the mic close, please.
Thank you very much for the speech and for the work you do. I have a question about the film. I wanted to ask you, what are you trying to achieve with this film? Like, how do you measure this achievement? Like, what should happen that will make you think that that's it, that's why I made this film?
Yeah, well, that's a question I think about quite a bit, right? And from the beginning, even though it evolved from its initial notion into other things, the film wrote itself as it went along, and as Jon Lee said, because he came and stayed at my house for a few days a couple of weeks ago, which is when he first proposed the idea of my coming here. And he, as he said, you know, I was in kind of 15-hour-a-day last ditch, because you don't ever finish a film. You just abandon a film. And obviously this story is not over. There is a very likely version of where it goes that's called a sequel or a companion piece. But my aim was clear. It was not to make, and I hope all these things could be also, but the goal was, and I like to think that it's achieved, the goal was not to make a legacy piece, not to say, oh, but will this be of value in 20 years? I hope so. But I have paid no attention to that. The goal was what I know best, which is what I don't know. So, whoever Sean Penn is, take away his famousness from movies, take away his, I'd like it to be more economic freedom than I have, but take away my economic freedom. And I am one more American who gives a shit, who's paying attention, who's skeptical about the news they read, who's trying always to be smarter, more humble in how I look for what the world is doing. And if I take that best of me version without those two key things of access through notoriety and freedom of travel through economic security, I don't know what the fuck's going on. There's no context. So first and foremost, this is a film made to speak to me without those things, because there's so many of them in my country, and I hope it translates to a bigger audience. But at the minimum, because we still are not sure in our silly two-party system and our antiquated electoral college which way the presidential election is going to go. And in either case, now is the moment, because there's still uncertain bipartisan support for arming and supporting Ukraine. And by the way, it's not just arming in country, it's also arming all of the women who have fled for the safety of their children to uncertain futures around the world, supporting the countries like Poland who have absorbed so many of those migrant flows, and it's all of it. And right now it's not clear which position the Democrats take and which the Republicans will take by the time of the presidential election. So now's the moment that I hope that our film can, which by the way significantly involves people from across my aisle, great friends of mine who are very conservative Republicans who are in the film, as well as Democrats. But we're not talking to people who are election deniers or otherwise psychotic conspiracy nuts masturbating their children's future away. But we're talking about sober people of different ideologies who are still ready to come together for Ukraine. And as they come for Ukraine, will they come for Georgia? Will they come for Cameroon? Will they come for the Appalachian Mountains? Will they come for... And how to get... And I know I'm blabbling on, but, I know it's a very low-hanging fruit to attack, or for me, Hollywood, right? But Hollywood is also just I don't even know what that is. I know some incredible people who have moved the dial in unseen ways from Hollywood that I put up with heroes from anywhere. And there's a bunch of bullshit, like there isn't any business or industry. It's just Hollywood is a kind of low-hanging fruit. But there is this moment to mobilize things that I think we all have to take advantage of and kind of offer a disciplined thought to. And social media has a kind of allergy to disciplined thought because it functions on a reward system that's very instantaneous. I think we've got to reach across the aisle, and until we have a center, that's the first step to a move of that center left. And if we're not careful, we're going to have a try for a far left that's going to get a center right and a far right. And so the film is for Americans first, to start honoring the solidarity and the unity of Georgians and Ukrainians in this existential fight. despite their leaderships, and honor that by being united ourselves.
One last one. So I get to ask the last question. So, Sean, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, I told you ZEG, and so it's a strange word. Now you've been told a lot more about it in the last few days. So what is it? What do you make of the festival? What do you make of ZEG? What do you make of this?
Okay, so full disclosure, Jon Lee and I have known each other and been friends for some time now. In most situations, when you're invited to support a political candidate or support an issue, increasingly one sort of looks into it and says, well, who's behind this? Did the Koch brothers seed this think tank, or was it Soros, or was it this, or I want to know where this is all coming from. But in this case, I consider him my pre-vetting authority, and when he said this is the goods, I kind of looked up everybody later after saying yes to coming here. And very, very honored to be here, because what I have found out and what I've seen is that this is going to be a major, major world conference every year. The curation of it, it's silly to say that the last two panels, which are the only ones I've seen in my history of the ZEG Festival, were not tough acts to follow, just fucking impossible, sorry kids, acts to follow, which is kind of relaxing because you don't try, you just let yourself stumble through your thoughts, because no matter what happens, you had the other two. But I think that it's really also because of the moment in time and the geography and the common history with Ukraine, which is the symbol of that which we are all dealing with right now most. But it's actually the most shining example because, yeah, it's true. We don't live under threat of war for the moment, or with a modern history of everyone being oppressed like so many. Probably everyone in this room has felt or had family members feel on levels I never have. But that's also such a strength, and it becomes the credibility of something like this festival. It'd be very hard for somebody who gets to know about this festival to go to Google Camp, but not also show up at ZEG. So.
All right. Thank you, Sean. Sean Penn, everybody, give him a hand. Thank you, ZEG. It's been wonderful. Thank you.